Hi there, welcome to this quick little video, or I hope a quick little video, all about deploying Droplet containers. Now, word of warning, this is not a tutorial that's going to take you through every single setting and how to do it. That's what our integration guides are for. This is more about giving you a general feel of the different approaches that different customers take. Droplet doesn't impose or decree that you use a particular method or approach for deploying the software. We basically want to run in any context and use any management system as a method of deploying the software. One example in the blog is something that's very old now, decades old, Microsoft Active Directory. Still people have access to this sort of stuff, and you can, it's still heavily used, and you can use it to deploy software. So here I've got a policy called Droplet Configuration, and this is the policy setting itself. And I can use software installation either at a computer level or a user level to deploy the software. It's really up to you how you target and filter whether you want to do it by computer or by user. I do it by computer. And then you can use the files feature of the system to push out those smaller metadata files that basically skin up our client with all the things that are needed. Now the goal here really is making it that you push out the software, the user gets their app, and no pop-up comes up saying accept the end user license agreement, or where is your license file, that kind of thing. You can also use this to push out the Droplet image as well, although what I've found in discussing this with customers, because of the size of the Droplet image and because they respond very, very well to zip utilities, most of my customers that use this approach still have a script that unzips the Droplet image and brings it down to the endpoint. I quite like this particular feature of pushing down files because it's in a UI, it's visual. I love scripts as well, but often scripts kind of represent the thought processes of a particular individual. And so if you've ever inherited somebody else's scripts, often it's like trying to get into the head of that person, trying to work out why it is that they've done it in this place. And that can often feel a bit arbitrary, and sometimes the scripts that you inherit from other people, they're not very good, and often I found it's easier to do your own because at least you know where you're going. So some people like this sort of more visual approach because it's not scripted. It's a very simple UI. This, you basically browse to where you're holding the central repository for all your metadata files, and then a path to indicate whereabouts you want it to be copied. The nice thing about this as well is it'll create all the directory structure as well. If you're scripting, unless you use a copy tool that creates directories, and you're just using the copy command, for example, the Droplet directory will need to be created in the user's profile first. Otherwise, the files won't be in the right location, if that makes sense. The other thing I quite like about this is that you have controls about whether you're creating the file, replacing, updating it, that sort of thing. And I also like the fact that with this particular method, you could say whether this process runs in a user context at all. And that's helpful for things like file ownership and making sure that whatever happens, it's happening in the context of not the administrator, but the user. Because these metadata files are stored in the user profile, they've got to be created in Joe Blogg's profile and not the administrator's. And the other thing I like about this feature as well, or this process, is it's got that kind of built-in logic to know that once this process is being done once, it doesn't have to keep on doing it again and again. Once you go down the scripting route, you always nearly always have to have some logic in the script that says, if this has already happened, don't run this script. And there's lots of ways of doing that, such as the if exists command in DOS-based batch files, or interrogating the machine to see whether the software is installed. So if you're a point and clicky kind of person rather than a script kiddie, I think sometimes people find these particular UIs friendly. So that's Active Directory. Another approach that lots of customers will take is a more scripted approach. I've started to use Microsoft Endpoint Configuration Manager, And I use it for those demos, but I also use it as the central store for all my different deployment methods. So I have one share which is both my scripted ones and also the stuff that I do through Endpoint, and sometimes there's an awful lot of overlap between them. So this is just an example. I'm not saying this is the way you should do it. This is not a template that we impose, and if I'm honest with you, I'm a good scripter but not the best. And I bet there are people who do a much better job of this than I do. But you know, it works and it suits my purposes. So the first thing I've got in my bundle, which I use to demonstrate our switch user feature, is a folder that contains the metadata files. That's quite straightforward. And also a folder where I have my Droplet image in a zipped up format. Yeah. I also have a settings JSON outside of that because that's the file that I tend to touch the most. So these in that folder are quite handy because I just want to dump all of that. Whereas the settings.json I could sometimes tweak based on what my needs are. Yeah. But essentially they're just files being brought down. This thing here is 7-zip. One of the things I find frustrating about the modern world is we still haven't seemed to have settled upon a industry-wide zip format that works across all platforms and also offers really, really good command line kind of tools for scripting purposes. And I think 7-zip is actually probably close to that as being my favourite tool for doing those sorts of things, having used lots of other things. We have an MSI, which is straightforward. It's going to do the install of the software. I've also got a shortcut here as well, which I will copy as part of my script. What that shortcut does is have behind it some special syntax of our software. Launch -- minimized. Now what that will do is launch our client front end, but always in the system tray. If I didn't have the -- minimized, the full client app would open, and if I didn't have the launch command, the container wouldn't start. I can use this syntax both in a per user model where each user has their own container and starts the container themselves, and I can also use this in the per computer model where the container starts as a system service. A couple of other ancillary scripts. I have a script that handles any pop-ups. The Droplet auto start basically is a script that says copy that link into the user's location. Yeah. And what else have I got? This particular script is the thing that handles all the profile stuff. I have a number of scripts that I kind of chain together to make my life easy. So this quite complicated one makes sure that any of the profile stuff gets copied in the right close location based on the context of the user and things like it. And that's about it really. The master script really, the one that chains all this sort of stuff together, is basically a big long script that calls each of those chunks. So I tried to make my scripts modular rather than having a flat file that does everything. I have a sequence of scripts that do individual tasks, and then a master script calls each of those. And the reason for doing that is that it makes it very easy for me from the master to remark out and remove components or edit components, rather than having a big flat file that contains everything. So, I mean, there's lots of different ways of achieving this, and this is just one example. So, what I have got is a clean system that doesn't have Droplet computing on. It's a machine, a virtual machine, that I'm using here rather than physical. I use a lot of virtual machines in my lab environment because I have to do so many demos with customers that doing it just with physical machines would mean an awful lot of manual undo and reset. And the nice thing about doing demos like this to customers in virtual machines is I can have the system snapshotted, I do the demo, and then revert the snapshot ready for the next customer. So it just makes my life a little bit easier. So I'm logged on as administrator. Yeah, I probably should use, you know, elevated rights and stuff like that, but I want to make my life simple. I'm in my own lab environment, so I don't have to have it too heavily bolted down from a security perspective. Because I never trust my own typing, the reason I'm browsing in this way is so I don't screw up while I'm doing this video and actually typing the actual paths and things like that. So my particular script does allow me to pass a secondary variable to indicate I'd like to store the droplet image in a particular directory and overriding that. I look at this now and think I don't really need this variable. I could just have setup.cmd and just accept that // droplet image was my default location. So I'm going to run this script so you can actually see what's happening. So the first thing that's going to take place is it's going to install WinZip, and the second thing it's going to do is download from my NAS to this endpoint the droplet image that I want to use. This is quite quick for me because I'm 1 gig throughout, but also my NAS and this virtual machine is on the same gigabit backbone. So the process of downloading the zip file isn't that slow. It would be even better if I had 10 gig. Hint, hint, Barry. I'd love another 10 gig environment. Barry's my boss and I'm always asking for more resources. You know what it's like. I think there's often a bit of a trade-off between zipping and extracting. You know, if you were on a 10 gig or a 40 gig network and you were doing it from a NAS to a VM, for example, you know, you've got to wonder whether there's any real benefit in zipping it up. But I think if you're dealing with 1 gig or less as a pipe, I think it's still worthwhile zipping and then extracting. You still speed up the process. Copying the other files, you know, takes, you know, very little time. So, you know, they're quite small files. And at the end of the process, I reboot the machine. Oh, look at that, a Windows update. Isn't that fun? You know, I've been in this industry for nearly 30 years and I'm still looking at little status bars and updates like this to the very end. But, you know, I guess such is our life. Anyway, you obviously don't want to watch a Windows update live because you get enough of that during your regular life. What I will do is let this process continue and we'll resume the video once all this updates has been completed. See you in a second. So if I double click at one of those shortcuts like Notepad, I'm going to be challenged for my credentials. That's because in the switch user model we do join the computer to the domain, and also I've installed the software as a computer service rather than as a kind of per user model. So yes, I am logged on as administrator, but this would work for any user. So there's my application, and obviously once I've got that open, I can run other apps too, such as an ancient version of Word or an ancient version of Excel. I do tend to pick in my demos an application that people recognize. To be honest with you, what most customers are doing if they're running a legacy application inside the container, it's usually some sort of bespoke application or some web-based application that has a Java or .NET or ActiveX dependency that just won't work natively on Windows 10. So that's me using a script to install the container. Let's have a look at my configuration for Microsoft Endpoint Configuration Manager, or what used to be called System Center Configuration Manager. So I have a MECM, I don't know how you're supposed to call this now, Microsoft Endpoint Configuration Manager set up here. And basically it acts as a repository for all my different configurations. It's quite a beast, I think, Microsoft Endpoint Configuration Manager, so it takes a while to set up. But it's extremely powerful because it can handle all sorts of different sort of situations. So I guess with flexibility sometimes comes complexity. You have a very simple product but not have that many options around it. So if you don't really know your way around this, just a few concepts. You do have what are called collections, and they're basically groups. Groups of computers, device collections, yeah, of which I probably only have one machine, a test machine in there, as an example. And it also has the concept of what's called a software library. Two main components here that I use a lot. I use applications to push out MSIs, whether that's our main MSI or our legacy accelerator, Intel Haxum. We're now more or less moving over to WHPX as our core accelerator. And then something called packages, which allows me to take a script and basically make it into an object that I can control. So behind one of these packages is usually some kind of program which points to a script. And I've gone for a very modular approach here where nearly every single task I've created a program for. So I have a program that handles the profile settings. I have a program that handles the copy down of the image. I have a profile that controls the startup of the container. I have a program that handles the post configuration. And a bit like in my approach to scripts, rather than having a flat script file that does everything, I have a series of smaller scripts which I then chain together. It gives me a bit more flexibility. I take the same approach with Microsoft Endpoint Configuration Manager as well. Where these scripts actually live is on my share here. I called this a call center app just to try and make it realistic. And it's very, very similar to the one that you were seeing a moment ago where I was just manually running it, to be quite honest with you. There's the MSI file for my WinZip, a batch file for doing some copying, the image file itself, all the profile data. This sort of evolved over time, I must admit, and I think with my later sort of configuration of this I started to get a more simpler directory structure, but it does the job. And I also, with this one, which you haven't seen already, have a script that enables WHPX, the hardware accelerator. There's really two ways of doing that. You can use Microsoft's DISM command to enable WHPX. I personally prefer the method that I found to use with PowerShell, mainly because it allows you to have the sort of logic components to say, you know, if this feature is already installed, don't try and carry out this task. If this feature is installed, then enable this option, and also, by the way, do a reboot as well. So yeah, so I quite like this approach. Trying to really show this is quite difficult because, you know, I think it took me about a week and a half to get it just how I wanted, and of course I was documenting all the way how I did that. But basically what happens is I take my device collection and then I assign to it those packages that I want to install. Yeah. So my idea here was that I could create another device collection and add in Droplet Computing 2.0, the security pop-up, the WHPX, but have a different package for not the call center people, but for the sales staff, and a different set of profile files for those sales staff. Yeah. So trying to use it modular, so that way you get to reuse these objects over and over again, rather than having to define them for each device collection that you have. Yeah. So I think the real power of these sorts of deployment tools is you automate a tiny process once, but if you need to use that automation again for another 50 people, you just have to pull it out of your library. So like a lot of administration tools, there's that initial tick of effort to get it set up and working, but in the longer term, you get all that time back in a process that's much more simpler to manage. So, demoing this, seeing a live install with what I've got is a VM that's not powered on yet, so it's, you know, dead to the world in a way. And the reason for that is when this machine starts, hopefully even before I start the logon process, and even after I've got into the log process, the Microsoft Endpoint Configuration Manager will detect the agent running in the system and start pushing the software to it. So let me power on this particular VM, and I'll load the remote console on it, and we'll have that maximized so you can see it in the whole view, and we'll just see that process running through for a system that's already kind of configured. Again, I'll log on as administrator. I could be logging in as any user. The nice thing about something like Microsoft Endpoint Configuration Manager is it handles all the elevation required to actually carry out certain tasks, which is another thing that you need to consider when you're doing any scripting. Is it's one thing to write a script and have it work as administrator, quite another to run a script and have it run properly under the context of a user. There you are. You can see that the software is now ready to be applied. This is what's called the Software Center in Microsoft's Endpoint Configuration Manager. And when it loads, you'll see the progress of my job. So it's now downloading the software and installing the software. So the software is now installed. The process is complete. And what's going to happen next is my system is going to restart itself because my script to enable WHPX is completed. So what I will do is not wait 10 minutes, but actually do that reboot myself. So the install has completed, and this is the first time I've logged on after the installation. What we'll find is in this particular configuration, the client is going to open up in a minimized view. Notice how the shortcuts were created on my desktop automatically. This is a per user model, so in this case the application isn't running as a system service, it's just running as an ordinary app. To be fair, in most cases, if it's running as an ordinary app, the reason that end users or customers are wanting to do that is that they don't actually want to run the container all the time, and they want to be able to fire up the container as and when they need it for a legacy application. So just to make the video a little bit more automated, I used that Droplet launch -- minimize as a shortcut in the startup location, so after logging on it would run automatically. For the most part, this application is just minimized to one side in the system tray area, and users don't interact with it. What they interact with, of course, is the Droplet Seamless app. So that concludes this video all about deploying Droplet software. The key takeaway is we're just an app to run an app. We're just a 100 meg or less MSI file and a bunch of files. You do not need a special management system, yet another single pane of glass in order to manage Droplet. You can leverage your existing technologies that you use to push out software to push out a Droplet container. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.